His tiny body was almost completely buried under the snow. His paws wouldn't move, his breath was fading, and the brutal cold had turned his fur into ice. He was alone in this frozen wasteland, and no one even knew he was there. But at the last moment, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, and what happened next changed everything. But let's start from the beginning. The night gripped the world in its icy embrace. The wind howled like a hunted beast, swirling snowdrifts across the desolate road. Here, far from warm homes and human laughter, nature revealed its merciless side. Frost creaked in the air, seeping into everything alive, demanding complete submission. Amidst this frozen wasteland, among the silent shadows of the night, lay a small creature, barely distinguishable from the snow. The tiny puppy's body was motionless, almost entirely covered by the white shroud that turned it into an unrecognizable lump. The frost had seized its fur, turning it into a stiff, brittle shell, and its little paws, barely curled toward its frozen belly, were locked in invisible chains. Its breath, weak, ghostly, wavered on the edge of vanishing. Once, it had a home. A warm corner, a soft blanket, the familiar scent of food. Voices filled the room, sometimes gentle, sometimes stern, but always alive. Every day, it waited for a hand to ruffle its fur, or for the chance to curl up at someone's feet. It believed it would always be that way. But that day, everything changed. The hands that once stroked it suddenly grabbed it roughly, placing it onto the hard seat of a car. The road was long, the tires rumbled, breaking the silence, but the puppy didn't understand where they were going. It wagged its tail, looking at the people, but they didn't look back. Then, the door opened, and the cold emptiness swallowed it whole. The car moved. Confused, the puppy ran after it. Tiny paws sank into the snow, slipping, trembling with exhaustion. It called out, first softly, then louder, straining its tiny voice, pleading for them to stop. But they never looked back. Now it was here, alone, in an icy hell where nothing alive could survive. The once trusting eyes slowly closed. The cold seeped deep inside, filling the emptiness within. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled, but the puppy barely heard it anymore. Headlights in the night. And then, out of the darkness, light appeared. Two beams of blinding yellow sliced through the night, sweeping across the snow-covered field until they caught a tiny, fragile shape. The car screeched to a halt, its wheels digging into the snow, and silence was replaced by the sharp sound of a door swinging open. A man stepped out. Tall, clad in a dark jacket, he moved toward the snowdrift, peering into the gloom. His boots sank into the soft snow, his breath rising in clouds. Then he stopped, standing over the small body, half buried in white. The puppy didn't move. The man knelt, carefully touching its paw. It was stiff, like a frozen twig. His heart clenched. No, not this. His fingers moved to the puppy's nose. Ice. Cold, lifeless ice. But somewhere, deep in his mind, a fragile, almost irrational hope flickered. Slowly, he lifted the puppy, wrapping it in the warmth of his jacket. And then, as his breath brushed against its tiny ear, the puppy's body twitched, just barely. An almost invisible movement, a breath so faint it was nearly silent. But it was there. It was still alive. The car raced forward, tearing through the night. Headlights cut through the snowy veil, wheels slicing the ice, grinding it down, but the driver didn't ease off the gas. One hand gripped the wheel, while the other, carefully, with the utmost gentleness, held a tiny, almost weightless body wrapped in his coat. The puppy didn't move, not even a shiver. He was too weak to fight. The warm air inside the car elicited no response, nor did the touch against his frozen paws. Only the rare, barely perceptible breaths, like the last flickers of a dying flame, signaled that there was still life in that fragile body. "Hold on, little guy," Jack muttered through clenched teeth, his fingers nearly crushing the steering wheel, but there was no response. He sped into the driveway, slamming the brakes. The car door swung open with a sharp thud, and in the next instant, Jack was sprinting toward the house, clutching the frozen creature against his chest. He shoved the door open with his shoulder, rushing inside and shutting it behind him, sealing himself off from the icy horror of the night. But the house was silent. The puppy still didn't move. Fire and Ice Jack lunged toward the fireplace, yanking off his gloves as he ran. The dry logs already crackled with flames, but warmth alone wouldn't instantly revive someone who had been trapped in the frozen darkness for so long. Moving on instinct, he grabbed an old cardboard box, threw a blanket inside, and carefully placed the puppy within it. His hands hovered for a moment. Touching the icy fur felt like touching death itself. But Jack knew. He was still alive. And Jack wasn't going to let him die. He snatched a plastic bottle from the cupboard, filled it with warm, not hot water. Too much heat could shock a fragile heart. Pressing the bottle gently against the puppy's sides, he tried to transfer some warmth to his frozen insides. His fingers massaged the stiff, frost-bitten paws, slow, careful movements, as if he were trying to pass even a sliver of his own life into that tiny, frozen body. But time kept ticking. 5 minutes passed. The puppy didn't move. 10 minutes. Nothing. Dead silence. The breaking point. Jack leaned over the box, closing his eyes. A heavy, suffocating fear grew inside him, pressing against his chest. Too late? He had lost friends before. He knew what it was like to realize that nothing could be changed. But this wasn't a soldier. This wasn't an adult who understood life's risks. This was a puppy, helpless, alone. And Jack couldn't just sit there and watch him die. His fists clenched. He rested his forehead against his knee, his voice breaking with quiet desperation. "Come on, little guy. You're a fighter." Silence. Then, almost imperceptible movement, a faint, weak twitch, a tiny shift of a nose. And then, a soft, barely audible whimper. Jack froze, lifted his head. His heart pounded faster. The puppy was alive. 2 days later, in the small house where firewood crackled in the hearth, life was slowly regaining its strength. The puppy lay on an old blanket by the fire, his tiny body no longer trembling from the cold. He was still weak, his movements slow and difficult, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there that night on the road. Life. He wasn't just existing anymore. He was watching. Amber-colored eyes followed the man who, every day, set food before him, placed a bowl of water nearby. Every morning, a gentle hand would brush over his small head, as if reassuring him, "You're safe. Everything's okay." The puppy didn't flinch. He didn't wag his tail, but he didn't shrink away either. He just lay there and waited. Jack knew that trust took time. He wasn't in a hurry. But something worried him. When the puppy walked, he had a slight limp. Sometimes he twitched in his sleep, as if haunted by nightmares. And Jack knew he had to find out what was really wrong. A visit to the vet. Jack didn't like vet clinics. They smelled of medicine, sterility, fear. The puppy trembled in his arms as they stepped inside the small office. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman in a white coat, her face kind yet keenly observant. She ran her hands gently along the puppy's back, carefully feeling his tiny limbs. "The pads of his paws are frostbitten," she said, frowning slightly. "But you got him in time. It's not severe. He'll recover." Jack exhaled in relief, but the vet wasn't finished. Her fingers lingered on the puppy's back, and her frown deepened. "Do you see these marks?" Jack tensed. "What about them?" She looked up at him. "These aren't from the cold." Silence filled the room. "What do you mean?" Jack's voice was quiet, controlled. The woman hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "These scars. It looks like he was beaten." Jack went still. The puppy. This tiny, helpless puppy. "And also," the vet continued, turning over the puppy's paw, "look at his claws. They're worn down. This happens when an animal desperately tries to escape from an enclosed space." She met Jack's gaze, her expression grave. "Most likely, he was locked up. In a box, in a trunk, somewhere. He wasn't just abandoned. They intended for him not to survive. The kind of anger you can't contain." Jack didn't move. But inside, everything boiled. He could see it now, this tiny puppy, trapped in the dark, scratching at a hard surface with desperate, bloody paws, calling out for the people he thought were family. His little heart hammering in his chest, frantic, terrified, and hope fading away. Jack's fingers curled into fists. What the hell? How could someone just throw away a living creature? Leave it to die on a freezing night in a snow-covered prison with no chance at survival? He knew the answer. People abandon those who are weaker because it's easier. He had seen it in the army, on the battlefield, in life. People walk away from responsibility because it's convenient. They don't want burdens. They make a choice to erase someone, to leave them behind and never look back. But not him. Not this time. Jack looked at the puppy. He just lay there on the examination table, his tiny paws stretched out like a stuffed toy. There was nothing in his eyes, no fear, no pain, no surprise, as if he was used to it. And that, more than anything, crushed Jack's chest. Gently, he lifted the puppy and held him close. The puppy stiffened slightly but didn't struggle. Jack looked at the vet, his voice quiet but firm. "He's never going back there." The woman nodded. Jack turned and walked out, holding tightly onto the small creature that would never be abandoned again. Several weeks later, Jack couldn't say exactly when the house stopped feeling empty. Maybe it was the first time he woke up to a soft nudge of a wet nose against his palm, or when he heard the quick, light footsteps on the wooden floor, accompanied by a joyful whimper. The puppy he had once found on the brink of death was now full of life. Max. The name had come naturally, short, strong. It suited the little fighter who had pulled himself out of the icy grip of the night. Now, he ran confidently through the house, his paws fully healed, and in those amber eyes was something that hadn't been there before. Trust. Max rarely left Jack's side. If Jack went to the shed, a small shadow followed. If he sat on the porch with his morning coffee, the pup curled up beside him, resting his head on his paws. He was always there, as if afraid that one day Jack would disappear, just like his former owners had. But that wasn't going to happen. Jack knew this as surely as he knew the sun would rise in the morning. Max was his dog, and he would never be alone again. An unexpected encounter. Jack never liked going to the supermarket. In a small town, everyone knew each other, and a simple trip to the store often turned into a string of unnecessary conversations. But that day, something made him freeze in the aisle. "Yeah, we moved, so we had to get rid of the puppy," a voice said behind him. "We just left him there. Let nature decide." At first, Jack thought he had misheard. Then the anger hit. Slowly turning, he saw a tall man, mid-20s, wearing an expensive jacket and a smug smile. He was talking to a friend, casually browsing drinks as if discussing the weather or last night's game. "Let nature decide." Jack stepped forward. "You just left him to die?" His voice was quiet, but there was a weight behind it. A warning. The man flinched, turning toward him. "Excuse me?" "The puppy." Jack took another step closer, closing the distance. "You left him in the snow, in the cold." The man pressed his lips together, then shrugged. "Well, it was just a dog. We couldn't take him with us." The next thing he saw was Jack's eyes. Dark, furious, locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "You left him to die." The store fell silent. People in nearby aisles stopped. The cashier paused mid-scan. The man swallowed hard. You don't even understand what you did, do you?" Jack's voice was level, almost calm, and that made it worse. The man averted his gaze, muttered something under his breath, and hurried away. Jack watched him go, his fists clenched at his sides. He could have said more. He could have thrown every burning thought in his head at that man. About how the puppy had called for them. About the frozen paws, the frost-bitten pads, the claws worn down to blood. But in the end, he realized it was useless. Some people will never understand. Some people will never feel guilt. But that man would never forget Jack's eyes, and that was something. A home they both needed. Driving back home, Jack felt the anger slowly settle, turning into something else. He pushed open the door, and he was already there. Max. Tail wagging, eyes bright with excitement, he rushed forward the moment Jack stepped inside. He didn't care what had happened beyond the walls of their home. He didn't care about the past. All that mattered was that Jack had come back. Max trusted him. Jack knelt, reaching out, running a hand over his soft ears. "How you doing, buddy?" His voice was warmer than it had been minutes ago. Max looked up at him with those wise, knowing eyes. And in that moment, Jack understood. Maybe he had saved Max that night, but deep down, he knew Max had saved him too.